I want you to imagine the most reliable thing in your life. Not your phone, not your family, the sun. The one thing that has risen bright and warm every single morning of every single life in human history. Now imagine that one spring, it just stops working. It still rises, but it's wrong, pale, weak, blue-white, like a coin seen through deep water. You can stare directly at it at noon without blinking. It casts no proper shadows, and it stays that way, not for a day, not for a week, for 18 months. That is not a story. That is the documented physical reality of the year 536 AD. The year scientists and historians have called, with modern data to back it up, the worst year to be alive in human history.
Not 1348, the Black Death. Not 1918, war and flu together. 536. Tonight, we're going to live through it. And then, we're going to solve it. Because for nearly 1,500 years, nobody knew what had happened. The answer was finally dug out of a glacier. And we'll get there. But first, the eyewitnesses. In Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the historian Procopius, a careful, skeptical man not given to hysteria, wrote this. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. He added that it looked perpetually like an eclipse, and that people were certain it meant death was coming. In Italy, a Roman statesman named Cassiodorus wrote letters that survive to this day, and they read like science fiction. We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon. The sun, he wrote, seemed to have lost its proper color, bluish, and the moon looked empty of splendor. He describes a summer without heat, where the harvest waits and waits for warmth that never comes. And here's the detail from his letters that gets me every time. He mentions that the seasons seem to have simply given up. The months that should have been ripening the crops are chilled. Farmers watched frost form on their fields in July. Now, put yourself there, because that's what this channel does. You're a farmer outside Rome. You don't have satellites, thermometers, or news. Your entire model of reality is sun rises, crops grow, winter comes, spring returns. God, or the gods, keep the wheel turning. And now, the wheel has stopped. The priest doesn't know why. The old people have never seen anything like it. Every morning you walk outside hoping today it's fixed, and it's not fixed. Your wheat is stunted and green in August. Your children ask you what's wrong with the sky, and you have absolutely nothing to tell them. Somewhere around the second month, a thought arrives that you can't unthink. What if it never comes back? 18 months, 540 mornings of a broken sun. Whatever you're imagining that did to people's minds, it was worse. And the dimmed sun, incredibly, was only the opening act. A few more details from that first broken year, because the small ones are the ones that haunt. Cassiodorus, in that same letter, notes that the moon was wrong too. Empty of splendor, even when full, as if the whole sky had been dimmed by the same dirty glass. Sailors reported strange blood-colored sunsets and sunrises, the one gift a sky full of aerosols always gives. And think about what no shadows actually breaks. The sundial. The main clock of the ancient world ran on shadow. For month after month, in the middle of the day, time itself became blurry. Meetings, prayers, watches, all the rhythms that shadow clocks governed smeared into guesswork. People didn't just lose their harvest, they lost their ability to tell what hour it was. And of course, they reached for explanations. An eclipse that wouldn't end. Divine anger? Omens were inventoried obsessively. Comets, earthquakes, strange births. Because when the sky breaks, the human mind would rather have a terrifying explanation than none at all. To one explanation nobody proposed because nobody could have, that an island of fire near the top of the world, which almost no one in the Mediterranean had ever heard of, had quietly repainted the ceiling of the planet. Here's what makes 536 genuinely frightening to study. The reports come from everywhere. This wasn't a local haze, a bad season in one unlucky province. The same broken sky was recorded by people who didn't know the others existed. In Ireland, the annals, year-by-year records kept by monks, note with terrible simplicity, a failure of bread. Then they noted again the next year, and again the year after that. 3 consecutive entries, each one representing a full year of hunger on an island at the edge of the known world. In the Middle East, a Syriac chronicle records that the sun was darkened for 18 months, and that each day it shone for about 4 hours only, and still this light was only a feeble shadow.
The fruit, it says, did not ripen, and the wine tasted like sour grapes. In China, an entire civilization away, keeping meticulous imperial records with no connection whatsoever to Irish monks, the histories of the period record something astonishing. Yellow dust rained down like snow. Frost in the middle of summer. Snow in August in provinces where that was unthinkable. Mass crop failure, followed by the 2 words that always follow it in official records, Great Famine. Some Chinese entries from the following years are among the darkest lines in any archive on Earth. Reports of the starving doing what the starving have always done, which I'll leave in the archive. One astronomical bureau in southern China even recorded Canopus, a bright star they observed on schedule for centuries as part of state ritual, simply failing to appear at the expected times. The sky itself had become unreliable. Stack these up for a second. Monks in Ireland, bureaucrats in Constantinople, chroniclers in Syria, astronomers in China. None of them can call each other. None of them can compare notes. And they are all describing the same event in the same window of time. The sun weakened, the summer failed, the food ran out. When historians find that kind of independent agreement, they stop asking if something happened and start asking a much more interesting question. What on this entire planet has the power to break the sky over Ireland and China at the same time? And here's the part that turns this from a history story into a detective story. The people of 536 went to their graves never knowing. Their children never knew. Their grandchildren never knew. For 14 centuries, these accounts sat in archives, dismissed by many historians as exaggeration. Monks being dramatic, chroniclers borrowing omens from each other. Pale sun? No shadows? Sure, medieval people said a lot of things. It took until the 20th century, until we learned to read 2 completely unexpected archives, one written in wood and one written in ice, for the eyewitnesses of 536 to be proven right about everything. The sun really had gone out, and we can now tell you almost to the season why. One more voice for the record, because it's the bleakest and the best. A church historian writing in Syriac, the chronicle attributed to Zechariah of Mytilene, records it almost like a weather report from the end of the world. The sun began to be darkened by day and the moon by night. Day and night broken in one sentence. Meanwhile, in Italy, Cassiodorus was writing something that should sound very modern, government advice. His letters from these months tell administrators, in effect, the harvest has failed, so open the granaries, move the stores, keep bread prices from riots. Disaster management 536 style, and evidence that at least some officials treated the broken sky not as an omen to pray about, but as a logistics problem to manage. It's oddly comforting. There are always logistics people, even at the apocalypse. One more geographic note. The southern hemisphere mostly dodged this one. A high-latitude northern eruption keeps its veil mostly north of the equator. If you were living in, say, southern Africa or Australia in 536, the sky stayed more or less honest. The worst year to be alive came with a postcode, and everyone we've met so far, from Ireland to China, had the bad luck to share it. Now we jump forward 1,400 years, because the mystery of 536 wasn't solved by historians, it was solved by scientists who weren't even looking for it. And the first breakthrough came from the most boring possible place: tree stumps. Here's the trick, in case you don't know it, because it's one of the most beautiful ideas in all of science. Every year, a tree adds one ring. Good year, warm, wet, long summer, fat ring. Terrible year, cold, dark, short summer, a ring so thin you need a microscope. A tree is a climate hard drive that cannot lie, cannot exaggerate, and cannot borrow omens from other trees.
And by matching overlapping ring patterns, living trees to old church beams to bog oaks pulled black and perfect out of Irish peat, scientists built continuous ring records going back thousands of years. In the 1980s, a dendrochronologist named Mike Bailey was reading the Irish oak record when he hit something that made him sit up. At 536, the rings don't just get thin, growth nearly stops and stays crushed for a decade. And it wasn't just Irish oaks. The same scar shows up in Scandinavian pines, Siberian larches, bristlecone pines in California, trees on the opposite side of the planet from those Irish monks flatlining in the same years. Bailey put the tree data next to the old chronicles and said essentially the monks weren't being dramatic. Something real, physical, and planetary happened in 536. Tree rings tell you when with absolute precision. They don't tell you what. For that, you need the second archive, ice. Every year, snow falls on Greenland and Antarctica and packs down into a layer, like a tree ring made of frozen sky. And trapped in each layer is a chemical snapshot of that year's atmosphere. If a volcano erupts anywhere big, its acid, sulfate, falls out over the poles and gets sealed into that year's ice, like evidence in a freezer bag. Drill down 2 kilometers, pull up a core, and you are literally holding a library of every year of weather for the last 100,000 years. Scientists drilled. They counted layers down to the mid-500s, and there it was, a massive sulfate spike, volcanic acid, right at the moment the sun dimmed. Then, unbelievably, a second huge spike a few years later, around 540, and a third around 547. Not one catastrophe, a cluster, a 1, 2, 3 punch, the atmospheric equivalent of getting knocked down and then kicked twice before you can stand up. And in 2018, a team led by glaciologist Paul Majewski and historian Michael McCormick went one step further with a core from a Swiss glacier, analyzing it in slices so fine they could read individual months. In the ice of early 536, they found microscopic shards of volcanic glass. Chemistry is a fingerprint. Every volcano's glass is chemically unique. They matched it. The prime suspect for the first eruption? Iceland. It was McCormick, by the way, who gave this whole story its title. Asked to name the single worst year to be alive in recorded history, he didn't say 1348, and he didn't say 1918. He said 536. The chronicles gave us the crime. The trees gave us the timestamp. The ice gave us the weapon. Now let me show you the murder itself. The detective story has a plot twist I skipped, and it's too good to leave out. For years, the scientists disagreed about the weapon. Mike Bailey himself, the tree ring man, looked at his data and suspected not a volcano, but a comet. Debris from space dimming the sky, a cosmic near miss. Others insisted on the volcano. And infuriatingly, for 2 decades, the two archives seemed to contradict each other. The ice cores appeared to show the big volcanic acid spikes in the wrong years, several years off from the tree ring disaster. Imagine the frustration. Your 2 perfect witnesses, wood and ice, telling different stories. The resolution came in 2015 in one of the great quiet triumphs of modern science. A team led by Michael Sigel recounted the ice core layers with new precision and found the old chronology had drifted by about 7 years in this period, thanks to miscounted layers deep in the ice. They re-anchored the timeline using tiny traces of known cosmic ray events found in both tree rings and ice. And when the corrected ice chronology snapped into place, everything aligned. Eruption 536, eruption 540, eruption 547. Tree ring collapse exactly on cue. That season every time. 2 independent planetary archives disagreeing for 20 years because of a counting error, suddenly telling the same story to the year. That's what proof looks like in climate forensics, and it's why we can speak about a 6th century sky with more confidence than about plenty of things that happened last decade. So, how does one volcano in Iceland switch off the sun over China? Walk through it with me, because the physics is both simple and terrifying. When a big volcano erupts, really big, the explosion doesn't just throw ash sideways over the neighborhood. It fires millions of tons of rock, ash, and gas straight up 20, 30 kilometers, punching through the weather layer of the atmosphere into the stratosphere. That distinction matters more than anything else in this story, because the lower atmosphere cleans itself. Rain washes ash out in weeks, but the stratosphere has no rain. Nothing washes out. Whatever you put up there
stays and spreads. And the killer isn't the ash, it's an invisible gas, sulfur dioxide. In the stratosphere, it reacts with water and turns into a planet-wide mist of microscopic sulfuric acid droplets. Billions and billions of tiny mirrors, a veil. And every one of those droplets does one simple thing. It bounces a little bit of sunlight back into space before it can reach the ground. One droplet does nothing. 100 million tons of droplets smeared by stratospheric winds into a shell around the entire northern hemisphere dims the sun everywhere. Ireland, Constantinople, China at once. That's why the sun looked pale blue.
That's why you could stare at it. That's why shadows died at noon. Light was arriving scattered from everywhere and nowhere, like the whole sky had become one giant frosted window. The 536 eruption, the evidence suggests, went off in Iceland in the early months of the year, and it loaded the stratosphere with so much sulfur that summer temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped by around 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. That number sounds small. It is not small. A 2-degree summer drop shifts frost into August, shortens the growing season by weeks, and kills harvests across an entire hemisphere in one season. Global average temperature is one of the most stubborn numbers in nature. Moving it 2 degrees in 1 year is like watching the sea level visibly change in an afternoon. And then, remember the ice cores? It happened again. Around 540, a second colossal eruption, possibly the volcano Ilopango in Central America, blasted a fresh veil into the sky before the first had fully cleared. And around 547, a third. Tree rings show the fever chart, the coldest decade in the last 23 centuries. Not the coldest year, the coldest decade. Summers failing back to back to back. One bad harvest, communities survive. Granaries, neighbors, fat years cushion lean ones. 2 bad harvests, the reserves are gone and the animals get eaten. 3 or more bad harvests in a decade, and the system that turns sunlight into bread into civilization simply breaks. And when bread breaks, everything downstream of bread breaks. Prices, taxes, armies, empires, faith. The sky was the first domino. Now we watch the rest fall. A little more on why this particular volcano was so vicious, because location matters enormously. A tropical eruption, like Tambora later, pumps its veil into skies that spread it over both hemispheres, diluting the pain globally. A high-latitude eruption, like Iceland's, keeps nearly the whole dose in the northern hemisphere, concentrating the dimming precisely over the hemisphere that held Rome, Persia, India, and China, the vast majority of humanity. Same size bomb, worse address. And the 536 event may have had a nastier trick still. Some evidence suggests the eruption was unusually rich in exactly the fine sulfur-heavy material that lingers longest. As for which Icelandic volcano, that honestly is still an open file. Iceland has dozens of capable suspects, and the 536 caldera hasn't been definitively identified. The glass shards give us the country, not yet the street address. The 540 eruption's prime suspect, Ilopango in El Salvador, a lake-filled caldera you can boat across today, has its own horror story. Locally, it buried Maya settlements under meters of ash and made a zone of Central America uninhabitable for decades. Which is a reminder worth pausing on. Everything in this video is the far-field damage, the global bruise. Somewhere at ground zero of each of these eruptions, there were villages for whom the question was never about pale sunlight. Let's come back down from the stratosphere to a kitchen. Somewhere in Gaul or Italy or Anatolia, pick any of 100,000 villages, there's a clay jar that holds the family's grain. And the rules of that jar have been the same for 1,000 years. Eat some, save some, plant some. The whole ancient world runs on that jar. Kings tax it, armies march on it, gods are thanked for it. In 536, the jar rules break. The first summer without sun, the harvest comes in stunted and sour, maybe half of normal. You tighten your belt, eat the reserve, trust next year. Ancient communities were built for one bad year. They'd survive droughts, floods, locusts. But this
isn't a drought. The thing that failed is the sun itself. And next year, it still failed. The second harvest is worse than the first. Now the reserve is gone. Now the seed grain, the sacred untouchable seed grain, the grain that is next year, starts looking like food. Eating your seed grain is the farmer's equivalent of burning your house to stay warm for one night. Whole regions did it, because the alternative was watching children starve in front of a full jar. Third year, whatever animals could be eaten have been eaten, including the oxen that pull the plows. Which means even if the sun returns, you can't plant properly anyway.
The famine now feeds itself. The Irish annals compress all of this into that one repeating line, a failure of bread. And honestly, no dramatic chronicle has ever hit me harder than that bureaucratic little phrase showing up 3 years in a row. In China, the dynastic histories report the Great Famine spreading province by province, food prices going vertical. Then the records shift to the language empires use when things become unspeakable. Migrations, disturbances, county registers that simply lose most of their names between one census and the next. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists digging centuries later found the physical version of the same story. Farm after farm from this exact period, abandoned. Not burned, not raided, just walked away from. Fields swallowed by forest. In some districts, most settlements going silent within a generation. Pollen samples from lake mud, yes, we can read ancient pollen like a diary, show cereal crops collapsing across the region and wild forest surging back over what had been fields. That's the botanical signature of a civilization getting smaller. And hunger never travels alone. Weakened bodies invite disease. Hungry regions invade less hungry ones. Grain prices become political explosives. In Constantinople, the government was soon juggling shortages while emperors' names were cursed in bread lines. Everywhere, the pattern is the same. The veil dims the sun starves the fields starve the people, and the people, desperate and moving and packed together around whatever food remains, prepare the stage, perfectly, tragically, for the next horseman. Because the worst thing about the years after 536 is that famine was only the second act. In 541, in a grain port on the Egyptian coast, something began moving through the food system itself, and it was about to make the broken sun look like the gentle part of the decade. One traveler's testimony belongs here because he walked through the hunger with his own feet. John of Ephesus, a churchman, crossed Anatolia in these years and left descriptions that read like war reporting. Villages where the living were too few and too weak to bring in what little harvest there was. Orchards of fruit that ripened wrong or not at all. Roads filling with people drifting toward rumors of food.
The ancient Mediterranean had a sophisticated answer to local famine: the grain trade. Egypt's endless wheat could feed a hungry Greece. Africa could cover a bad year in Italy. But that system has one design assumption: the bad year is local. When the whole hemisphere fails at once, the world's insurance policy is void. Every province files a claim, and nobody's granary can pay out. Prices did what prices do. Chroniclers note grain in some regions selling for multiples of its normal price, when it could be found at all. And underneath the economics, something psychological was shifting. Ancient famines had always been read as punishments: angry gods, sinful cities. But this one came with a visibly broken sun. Worldwide, year after year, apocalyptic religion boomed. Not the last time in this story that the sky's behavior would permanently rewire what people believed. To understand what happens next, you need to see what was standing tallest when the sky broke. Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, was in 536 quite possibly the greatest city on Earth. 500,000 people, marble forums, a hippodrome seating tens of thousands, aqueducts, seawalls no enemy had ever breached. And on the throne, Justinian, a Balkan peasant's nephew who had risen to absolute power and decided, with a straight face, that he would restore the entire Roman Empire, reconquer the lost West, rebuild Rome itself. And for a while, you have to give the man credit, it was working. His general, Belisarius, one of history's true military geniuses, had just taken North Africa back from the Vandals in a lightning campaign. And by 536, yes, that exact year, was landing in Italy to take back the homeland itself. Beside Justinian ruled the Empress Theodora, a former actress from the city's rough entertainment world, brilliant and fearless. When a riot nearly toppled the throne a few years earlier, it was Theodora who refused to flee, telling the panicking court, in essence, that the imperial purple makes a fine burial shroud. Justinian stayed. The riot was crushed, and from its ashes, Justinian raised the building that still defines the skyline of Istanbul, the Hagia Sophia, a dome so vast and impossible that when it was completed in 537, 1 year into the broken sun, Justinian reportedly walked in and whispered, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." Hold that image. An emperor completing the greatest building in the world under a sun that barely shines, while his armies fight for Rome and his people queue for bread. Because that's the thing about 536. It didn't strike some fragile, declining kingdom. It struck civilization at full sprint. The empire had a professional army, a tax system, grain fleets, hospitals, a postal service. The most sophisticated machine humanity had yet built. And machines have a property that villages don't. Everything is connected to everything. The grain fleet feeds the capital pays the army holds the frontier protects the grain.
Remove one gear and the whole mechanism begins to grind. The dimmed sun was already stressing every gear at once. Harvests down, prices up, provinces muttering. Justinian's response was pure Justinian: push harder. The wars continued. The taxes continued. He needed them more than ever. The building continued. You can read the confidence in every surviving mosaic. This empire believed it was eternal, believed its worst enemy was the Goths or the Persians, believed the strange sky was an omen that would pass. It had no way of knowing that the actual enemy was 8,000 kilometers of connected trade routes, the empire's own greatest achievement, and that the enemy was already aboard the grain ships.
The very network that made Byzantium rich was about to become the delivery system for the deadliest pandemic the human species had ever experienced. 2 footnotes on Justinian's city that make the picture even stranger. First, the Hagia Sophia's famous dome, the one Justinian boasted about, didn't survive this era intact. Weakened by earthquakes in the 550s, it collapsed in 558, right onto the altar. The empire, mid-plague, mid-everything, simply rebuilt it, higher and stronger within 5 years. That's the same civilization that was supposedly dying. It's worth remembering both facts at once. Second, while all this was happening, Justinian's other project quietly conquered the future. Years earlier, he had ordered the entire chaotic mass of Roman law, 1,000 years of statutes, contradictions, and case law, distilled into one organized code, the Corpus Juris Civilis. That book outlived the plague, outlived the empire, got rediscovered in medieval Italy, and became the DNA of legal systems across most of Europe, Latin America, and beyond. There's a decent chance the laws governing your apartment lease descend through many generations from a code compiled in Constantinople while the sun was broken. Civilizations under catastrophe don't just collapse. They also, sometimes in the same decade, file the paperwork for the next 1,000 years. The year is 541, 5 years into the cold. The place? Pelusium, a grain port where the Nile Delta meets the Mediterranean, one of the loading docks of the imperial bread machine. People start dying strangely. Fever, then swellings in the groin and armpits, hard, agonizing lumps the size of eggs, delirium, black blisters. Most who develop the swellings are dead within days. We know exactly what it was, and not from guesswork. Modern archaeologists have pulled the killer's DNA from the teeth of 6th century skeletons. Yersinia pestis, the plague. The same bacterium as the Black Death, but this is 800 years earlier. This is its first confirmed world tour, and history calls it the Plague of Justinian. Where did it come from? The DNA points toward origins in Central Asia. It likely moved with trade down the Red Sea or overland, then found the Egyptian grain system. And here, the 536 catastrophe plays its cruelest card.
Because the plague's real vehicle isn't people, it's fleas riding on rats. And what do rats live in? Grain. The empire's greatest pride, a fleet system that could move Egyptian wheat to Constantinople in weeks, warehouses in every port, subsidized bread for the capital, was, from a rat's point of view, a global rodent superhighway with catering. Famine had already pushed hungry people into the cities and around the granaries. The cold years may even have disrupted the ecology of wild rodents in Asia, nudging infected fleas toward human food chains. That part is still debated science, but the timing is grim. 5 years after the sun broke, the plague enters the machine. In spring 542, it reaches Constantinople. What follows is one of the most harrowing eyewitnessed events in ancient history, because Procopius was there. He describes a city where the dying quickly outran all burial, where at the peak, he claims, and even if he inflates, the true number is nightmare enough, thousands died every day for months. The tombs filled, the mass graves filled. In the end, the authorities tore the roofs off the fortress towers across the Golden Horn at a place called Sike and filled the towers themselves with bodies, layer upon layer, until, Procopius says, an evil stench pervaded the city. Work stopped, markets closed. The bread machine, the reason the city existed, ran with skeleton crews. People wore name tags leaving the house so their bodies could be identified. And then the plague did the one thing nobody could have scripted. It reached the palace. The Emperor Justinian himself, ruler of the civilized world, the man rebuilding Rome, developed the swellings. The empire held its breath. And he survived! One of the few. He woke from the fever into a different empire. His treasury collapsing, his tax base literally buried, his armies unpayable, his Italian reconquest bleeding out for lack of men and money. And the plague wasn't done. This wasn't one epidemic. It became a resident of the Mediterranean world, returning in waves every decade or two for the next 2 centuries. Estimates of the total toll vary wildly. Scholars argue between many millions and tens of millions across those waves. Some older claims run higher. But the direction is not in dispute. This was the first pandemic, striking a world already starved and frozen.
The broken sun had loaded the gun. The rats delivered it. A few more scenes from the plague years, all from eyewitnesses. John of Ephesus, him again, unluckiest travel schedule in history, journeyed from Constantinople through Palestine and Asia Minor as the pandemic spread, and describes the road itself as the horror. Houses standing open with no one alive inside, flocks wandering with no shepherd, and at sea, ships found drifting on calm water, cargo intact, every soul aboard dead at their stations. Ghost ships centuries before the legend. In the capital, Procopius records the strange bureaucracy of mass death. The emperor assigned a palace official, Theodore, to organize body collection when private burial broke down. History remembers almost nothing else about Theodore, but for one unbearable year, he may have had the worst job any human being has ever held.
Doctors, Procopius admits with unusual honesty, could not predict who would live or die. The disease ignored every theory they had. Some who caught it survived, like the emperor, and survivors seem to have carried some protection through the later waves. An immunological fact 14 centuries before anyone had the word. And one demographic detail that echoes across every plague in history. The disease killed the young and strong as readily as the old, which is precisely what breaks a society's back. Fields, armies, and shipyards all run on the 20-year-olds.
Let's take stock of the 540s, because I want you to feel how the dominoes connect. The sun, still recovering, with the second eruption of 540 having re-darkened the sky just as it began to clear. The fields, a decade into failed and half-failed harvests. And now, the people who work the fields, crew the ships, pay the taxes, and fill the armies, dying in waves. An empire is, at bottom, arithmetic. So watch the arithmetic. Justinian's government, desperate for revenue with half its taxpayers dead or ruined, did something that tells you everything. It made the survivors liable for their dead neighbors' taxes. Imagine surviving the end of the world and receiving the end of the world's tax bill. Then look at the coins, because coins never lie. Within a few years of the plague's arrival, the imperial mint reduced the weight of the gold coinage for a stretch. The fallus, the everyday copper money, had already been slimming. When an empire starts shaving its own sacred currency, you are watching a fever chart of the treasury. The army arithmetic was worse. The reconquest of Italy, Justinian's life project, the whole point of his reign, had been on the edge of total victory. After the plague, recruits and pay dried up. Belisarius was recalled, sidelined, at one point left commanding a phantom army he had to pay from his own pocket. The Goths counterattacked. The war that should have ended in the 540s dragged on to 554, leaving Italy, the prize itself, so devastated by 20 years of fighting that Rome, the Eternal City, changed hands 5 times and shrank to a fraction of itself. Byzantium technically won. It won a wasteland at a price that helped ensure it could never truly hold it. Meanwhile, the other superpower, Persia, was living the same nightmare. The plague didn't check passports, and the two exhausted giants spent the following decades bleeding each other in wars neither could afford, right up to the early 600s, when they fought one final, apocalyptic, mutually ruinous war. And into the vacuum left by two hollowed-out empires, barely a decade after that last war ended, came something nobody in Constantinople or Ctesiphon saw coming. The armies of a new faith out of Arabia, which within a single century would take Syria, Egypt, Persia entire, and reshape the map of the world permanently. Now, real historians will rightly tell you that's a long causal chain and that empires are not billiard balls. Islam's rise had its own engines, and Byzantium had many wounds. Fair. But a broad scholarly case made seriously in recent decades is that the century of catastrophe that opened in 536, cold, famine, and above all 200 years of recurring plague, is a load-bearing part of the story of why the ancient Mediterranean world ended and the medieval world began. Some historians literally use this period as the hinge. Antiquity on one side, the Middle Ages on the other, and the pivot is a decade when the sun went out. One number to hold on to as we leave the empire: by the time the plague cycles finally burned out in the mid-700s, the population of the Mediterranean basin may have been reduced on a scale Europe wouldn't see again until the Black Death. Entire towns on old maps simply stop existing. And yet, humans being humans, through all of it, somewhere in Constantinople, the chariot races kept running. Civilization is shockingly hard to kill. Which brings us to the part of the world where it very nearly was killed, and where the memory of 536 got carved into mythology so hard we still tell it today: north, to the lands of the long winter. One last document from the wreckage, because it's history's strangest book review of an emperor. Procopius, the same careful historian who chronicled the wars and the plague, also wrote a secret manuscript, unpublished in his lifetime, known today as the Secret History. In it, the measured official historian goes absolutely feral. Justinian, he writes, was not a man but a demon in human form. Courtiers, he reports with a straight face, claim to have seen the emperor rise from his throne at night and walk the halls without a head. His mother allegedly confessed he was fathered by a spirit. This is what living through the 540s did to the empire's most rational public intellectual. The catastrophe was so total that my government made mistakes inflated into my government is literally run by the devil. Historians treat the Secret History as venomous satire, but it preserves something real: the psychological wreckage of a generation that had watched sun, harvest, and neighbors fail in sequence and needed the scale of the blame to match the scale of the pain. Justinian, demon or not, outlasted nearly everyone. He died in 565, pushing 90, still on the throne, having outlived Theodora, Belisarius, and the world he was born into. His empire survived too. Smaller, poorer, medieval now rather than Roman, but alive, which by the standards of this decade counts as a triumph. In Norse mythology, the end of the world has a very specific weather forecast. Before Ragnarök, before the gods die and the world drowns, comes the Thimble Winter. 3 winters in a row with no summer between them. Snow drives in from every direction. The sun gives no warmth. Bonds break, brothers fight, and the world of men starves in the dark.
For centuries, scholars filed that under mythology, dramatic. Then archaeologists and climate scientists started comparing notes on what actually happened to Scandinavia after 536, and a chilling idea took shape, now argued seriously in academic journals. The Fimbulwinter may not be a prophecy at all.
It may be a memory, because the north is exactly where a dimmed sun bites hardest. Around the Mediterranean, a 2-degree summer drop ruins harvests. In Scandinavia, where barley ripens in a knife-edge window of a short summer, 2 degrees doesn't reduce the harvest, it cancels it. Tree rings from the region show summers after 536 among the worst ever recorded there. And the archaeology reads like a horror novel written in real estate. Across parts of Sweden and Norway, huge numbers of farms and villages from exactly this period are simply abandoned. In some districts, Upland, Öland, elsewhere, estimates run to well over half, in places up to 3/4 of settlements going silent within a generation or two. Pollen cores show the fields themselves surrendering, cereal pollen collapsing, birch and forest marching back over land people had farmed for 1,000 years. Population estimates for parts of Scandinavia in this period suggest a collapse that took centuries to undo. Now for the detail that gives me actual chills. In the decades after 536, Scandinavians buried gold, hordes of it, arm rings, coins, exquisite gold figurines deposited in bogs and fields all over the region, one of the greatest concentrations of gold offerings in Scandinavian prehistory. And then, notably, the custom fades. One interpretation, advanced by Swedish archaeologists, these weren't savings accounts. They were sacrifices! Gold is the sun's metal, sun-colored, sun-bright. If your world is dying because the sun has failed and your gods aren't listening, what is the biggest offer a chieftain can put on the table? You give the sun your gold. You bury sunlight in the earth and beg the sky to take it and turn the lights back on. Whether or not every horde reads that way, something theological clearly broke in the north. The archaeology of the following century shows a culture transformed. More militarized, more stratified, power concentrating in the halls of warlords who controlled what food remained.
Some scholars argue the trauma of the 536 decade helped forge exactly the hard, fatalistic, raid-ready warrior culture whose descendants, 2.5 centuries later, would explode out of the fjords in longships. The Vikings, history's most famous apocalypse preppers, great-great-grandchildren of the generation the sky betrayed. And their myths kept the receipts. The wolves that devour the sun and moon, the gods who die and stay dead. And after Ragnarök, the Norse end-time story does something almost no other apocalypse does. The world comes back. The earth rises green from the sea. The sun's daughter takes her mother's road across the sky.
A new dawn after the monstrous winter? That's not just myth. That's what actually happened in the 550s. The veil thinned, the summers returned, the survivors replanted. The people of the North watched the world end and then watched it come back. And they never, ever forgot. We're still telling their trauma today. We just call it fantasy. For the skeptics keeping score, and you should always keep score, here's why the Fimbulwinter theory is taken seriously rather than filed with Ancient Aliens content. It's the convergence. The myth specifies a multi-year winter with failed summers. The tree rings show exactly that in exactly this region at exactly the moment Scandinavian settlement patterns collapse. The myth describes the sun being devoured. The region's rock art and artifacts before this period are obsessed with the sun. Sun wheels, sun chariots, sun horses. And after the 6th century, archaeologists see the old sun-centered cult imagery fading, as if a religious contract had been broken and torn up. Swedish archaeologist Bo Graslund, who developed the argument, points out that the Edda's language is oddly meteorological for poetry. Snow from all directions, biting winds, a sun that gives no gladness. And Old Norse literature preserves one more eerie detail. In the Ragnarök narrative, before the end, people survive on each other's failure. Kinship collapses. Brother will fight brother. Famine sociology versified. None of this is provable the way an ice core is provable. Myths don't carry lab certificates. But when an oral culture's deepest nightmare matches the physical record of its worst real decade this precisely, the boring explanation that they remembered starts to look like the strong one.
Trauma, it turns out, has a half-life of centuries, and poetry is how it survives transport. Zoom the map all the way out now, because a broken sky doesn't care about borders, and 536 left fingerprints on every continent we know how to check. Start in China, where we began. The dimming hit a land already split between warring dynasties, and the years after the yellow dust fell like snow, the histories record famine on famine. And within 15 years, the Northern Wei's successor states and their rivals had convulsed rebellions, coups, and collapses. No serious historian pins China's 6th century chaos entirely on a volcano. The politics were already on fire. But the cold years poured fuel on every crisis at once. Hungry armies mutiny faster, starving provinces rebel harder, and a dynasty that cannot feed the capital loses the mandate of heaven in the most literal way imaginable. Korean chronicles from the same window record famine and royal relief measures. In Japan, the era's records are thinner, but the region's tree rings tell the same story of crushed summers. Swing across the Pacific, and here the story gets genuinely mysterious. On the north coast of Peru, the Moche civilization, master goldsmiths, pyramid builders, irrigation engineers of the desert, enters a period of severe crisis in the mid to late 6th century. Climate records from Andean ice cores show decades of chaos, brutal drought punctuated by catastrophic flooding, the fingerprint of a Pacific gone haywire. Archaeologists find Moche cities of this era ramping up warfare. And harrowingly, human sacrifice, including a famous excavation of dozens of sacrificed men in the mud. Offerings made, perhaps, to gods who controlled rain that would not behave. Was that the same global event? The dating is close, the science still argued. I'll flag it honestly as an open case. But if it connects, then a volcano near the Arctic Circle helped drive priests in Peru to desperate offerings, and neither side of the Pacific ever knew the other existed. Even the great city of Teotihuacan in Mexico, one of the largest cities on the planet, enters its final decline in this same rough window, and some researchers have wondered aloud about the timing. And then there's the echo history barely wrote down, the steppe. The endless grass highway between China and Europe, home of nomad empires. Cold years reshuffle the steppe like a deck of cards. Grass fails, herds die, tribes move, and whoever they crash into moves too. It is exactly in the generation after 536 that a new power, the Avars, comes boiling westward off the steppe into Europe, driving other peoples before them toward the Danube. Refugees and conquerors arriving at the door of a Byzantium already gutted by plague. Meanwhile, Slavic peoples begin their great expansion into a depopulated Balkans, moving into lands the catastrophe had emptied. The world map we take for granted, where Slavs live, where Turkic peoples spread, which empires survived to write the histories, carries dents from this decade the way a car carries dents from a hailstorm. One volcano, then two, then three. And on every continent, in every language, the same year 0. Two more distant echoes worth logging in the case file. Britain. The plague did not respect the channel. Within a few years of Constantinople's outbreak, the Welsh annals record a great mortality sweeping the island. And among its named victims is Maelgwn, the most powerful king in Wales. A death that reshuffled power across post-Roman Britain just as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were forming. Some historians suspect the plague hit the native British communities, still trading with the Mediterranean, harder than the more isolated Saxon settlements, quietly tilting the demographic battlefield of early England. Speculative, but the kind of speculation that keeps medievalists up at night. And Arabia? In these same decades, the Great Marib Dam in Yemen, an engineering wonder that had watered a kingdom for 1,000 years, suffered its final catastrophic breaks. And the last one, around 570, sent whole tribes migrating north across the peninsula. Islamic tradition remembers the dam's failure in the Quran itself. Around that same year, in a trading town called Mecca that sat on the roots those disruptions were reshaping, a boy named Muhammad was born. The 6th century's chaos didn't cause what came next, but it set the furniture of the room where the 7th century happened. History's biggest events tend to walk in through doors that catastrophe unlocked a generation earlier.
All right, courtroom time. The charge?
worst year to be alive ever. And 536 has serious competition, so let's actually hear the rivals. Candidate 1, 1348, the Black Death. The heavyweight, it killed a third of Europe or more. In raw mortality percentage, probably history's champion. But here's the case against. If you survived it, the aftermath was, for the poor, weirdly an improvement. Labor became scarce, wages rose, serfdom weakened. The sun still shone, the harvest still came. Horrific year, but with a floor under it, and for survivors, a dawn after. Candidate 2, 1918. A world war ending and a flu that killed tens of millions, more than the war itself. Catastrophic. But the world of 1918 had trains full of grain, telegraphs, doctors, states that could organize relief. The system bent, it did not break. 2 years later, the world was roaring. Candidate 3, 1177 BC, the Bronze Age collapse. Real end of civilization stuff, but stretched over decades, and honestly, we still can't see it clearly enough to judge. Now, 536's closing argument. What makes it the worst is not any single body count. It's the combination, and the fact that no one could understand any of it. First, the trigger hit everyone. Not one city, one empire, one hemisphere's disease pool, the actual sun. The same sun for a monk in Ireland and an astronomer in China.
There was nowhere to run because the thing that broke was the sky. Second, it didn't let up. 536 wasn't a year, it was the trapdoor into the worst decade in 23 centuries of tree rings. Eruption, 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 famine, compounding famine, and then 5 years in, the first pandemic in world history arriving on top, like a punchline written by the cruelest author imaginable, and staying for 200 years. The Black Death was a horror with an ending. The 536 Cascade was a horror that became the new climate. Third, and this is the part that separates it from every modern catastrophe, the terror of total incomprehension.
In 1918, people knew what influenza was, even if they couldn't cure it. In 536, the sun dimmed, and no living person on Earth knew why, whether it was permanent or what could possibly be done. Imagine every crisis you've lived through, but with no news, no explanation, no timeline. Just a wrong-colored sun, colder every month, and the growing suspicion that the world was simply ending. Procopius wrote that men expected death. The Norse apparently concluded the gods themselves were dying. And when historian Michael McCormick, the Harvard scholar who co-led that Swiss ice core study, was asked to pick history's darkest year, he didn't hesitate, and his verdict made headlines around the world. It was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year.
The ice agrees, the trees agree, the monks, vindicated after 14 centuries, agree. Case closed. 536 keeps the title. But before we close the file, there's one more question. The one you've maybe been holding this whole time. This was a volcano. Volcanoes don't check calendars, so could it happen again? Could it happen to us? Short answer, it already has. Recently enough that it wrote one of your favorite books. Final chapter. In fairness, the defense gets one more word, because there is a revisionist case, and honest history means hearing it. Some recent scholars have argued the Justinianic plague's death toll is inflated, that outside the big connected cities, life went on, and that our horror comes from a handful of dramatic urban eyewitnesses. The debate is live, with DNA evidence and burial archaeology still coming in, and the maximalist numbers have real critics. But notice, even the minimalists don't dispute the broken sun. The tree rings and ice cores are beyond argument, and even they concede the plague was real, recurrent, and devastating where the records let us see clearly. The argument is about how far the darkness spread, not whether it fell. And one more reason 536 wins the title that has nothing to do with mortality tables. It's the only candidate where the catastrophe itself was invisible to its victims. Every other terrible year, people could at least see their enemy. A war, a sickness, a flood. In 536, the enemy was a stratospheric aerosol layer, a thing that would not even have a name for 13 more centuries. They were fighting something they could not see, could not name, and could not imagine. With prayers, with buried gold, with whatever they had. That's not just the worst year, that's the loneliest one. April 1815.
Mount Tambora, Indonesia. The largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. Significantly bigger, most estimates say, than anything in the 536 cluster. It blew the top kilometer off the mountain, and the following year, 1816, went down in Western memory with a name that should sound very familiar by now. The year without a summer. Snow fell in New England in June. Crops failed across Europe, still exhausted from the Napoleonic Wars. Food riots hit Britain and France. In Switzerland, the failed harvests brought genuine famine. Sound familiar? It's 536 in miniature. Same physics, same veil, same hungry aftermath, just one eruption instead of three, hitting a world with better ships and bigger granaries. And here's the glorious footnote. That miserable, rain-locked summer trapped a group of young English tourists indoors by Lake Geneva, bored out of their minds. And to pass the endless gray evenings, they held a ghost story contest. One of them was 18-year-old Mary Shelley. The book she started that summer was Frankenstein. Lord Byron, in the same gloomy house, wrote a poem called Darkness that begins with the sun extinguished. He was describing the actual sky outside. So yes, a volcano gave us science fiction's founding novel. The 536 playbook, it turns out, runs on schedule, geologically speaking. 1815, Tambora. 1883, Krakatoa, whose blood-red skies were painted around the world. Some art historians argue the screaming sky in Munch's The Scream is a Krakatoa sunset over Oslo.
1991, Pinatubo in the Philippines, 20 million tons of sulfur into the stratosphere, and global temperatures measurably dropped about half a degree for 2 years. The whole 536 mechanism, watched live by satellites this time, confirmed to the decimal point. So could a 536 happen again? The honest answer from volcanology? Yes. Eruptions of that class are a matter of when, not if, on timescales of centuries. We'd see it coming days ahead at best. No technology we possess can plug a volcano or scrub the stratosphere. The veil would spread just like before. But, and here's the difference worth sleeping on, we would know.
Within hours, every phone on Earth would explain the dimmed sun. We'd know it lasts 2 or 3 years, not forever. We have a global food trade, seed banks, and Arctic vaults. And the small psychological superpower the people of 536 were denied? An explanation and a timeline. The terror of 536 wasn't just hunger, it was the not knowing. That, at least, we've fixed. And on that ledger, spare one last thought for the people who lived it. Because here's the quiet miracle hiding inside the worst year ever. They made it. Not all of them, not even most in some places, but enough.
Enough farmers replanted when the sun came back, enough monks kept writing, enough parents fed their children through 18 months of Twilight that you and I exist to hear about it. Every single one of us descends from someone who watched the sun die in 536 and got up the next morning anyway. And the morning after that, 540 times until the light returned. The sun came back. It always came back. It will be there in the morning. You can check when you wake up. Good night. And if you like this journey, there's a whole library of them on this channel. The entire history of money, the greatest con artists who ever lived. The candle's still lit. Sleep well. The Tambora aftermath has a few more gems that show how weirdly creative catastrophe can get. In the hungry year of 1817, with horses dying and oats priced like silver, a German inventor named Karl von Drais unveiled a machine for getting around without a horse. The running machine, a 2-wheeled wooden contraption you straddled and pushed, the direct ancestor of the bicycle. Some historians genuinely argue your bike exists because a volcano killed the horses. The same gloom-soaked years gave us Turner's fever-colored sunsets, painted under skies still loaded with Tambora's aerosols. And in famine-struck Germany and Switzerland, waves of emigration that helped push thousands of families toward America. There are American towns whose founding traces to families starved out by a volcano they never heard of. As for the future, volcanologists rank eruptions on the VEI scale, and the 536 class events are thought to recur somewhere on Earth every few centuries. We are not overdue in any scientific sense, but we are in the window, permanently.
The good news is real. We now watch every dangerous volcano on the planet with satellites, seismometers, and gas sensors. A big one would not surprise us the way it surprised Procopius. The honest news is also real. Watching is all we could do. The veil would spread, the sun would dim, and humanity would get to run the 536 experiment again. This time with warehouses, greenhouses, and an explanation. The people of 536 had none of those. They had each other and stubbornness. It was just barely enough.